That night, something was wrong. From the beginning, the flames advanced selectively, sparing some mansions while destroying everything around them. And then I listened to men hidden in the smoke, talking about leaving no trace, what was happening there, and more importantly, who was behind it. If you like mysteries and want to understand how these events can be linked to something much bigger, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this video. Anyone who wants to discover ways to protect their family in difficult times will want to check it out. Leave your opinion in the comments after watching. This could be just the beginning. My name is Jack Sullivan, and being a firefighter is more than my profession. It's my life. After 20 years, I believe that nothing could surprise me. I have faced tragedies that would leave anyone sleepless for weeks. But that night, when the alarm went off and I heard the radio message about a fire in the Hollywood Hills, something seemed off. As I was getting dressed, the muffled sound of the TV caught my attention. A massive fire threatens luxury areas in Los Angeles, including the mansion of rapper and businessman P. Diddy. It was the kind of news that shouldn't affect me. Fires in rich neighborhoods were nothing new. But there was something about that sentence that stuck in my mind. Maybe it was the reporter's tone or the name involved, I don't know. I just felt like that night would be different. In the living room, Emily, my wife, was standing, leaning against the doorframe. Her gaze was so intense it seemed to pierce my soul. She knew, as I did, that every emergency exit could be her last. But in that moment, it felt different. She held my hand tightly. "You're going to come back, aren't you?" There was something about the way she spoke that got to me. I responded with a forced smile, and the same cliche I've used for years. "I'll always come back." But inside, I knew she felt the weight of that night as much as I did. In the truck, the atmosphere was tense. No one made jokes or comments to relieve the pressure. As usual, the air was heavy and we all felt it. Outside, the sky was a surreal painting, orange, red and black, as if the world was on fire. Mike, the youngest on the team, broke the silence. "Jack, have you ever seen anything like this?" He was pale and his voice was shaking. I wanted to lie to calm him down, but I couldn't. The truth was that I had never seen anything so threatening. As we approached the burning hills, Emily's voice echoed in my head. "You're going to come back, aren't you?" We arrived at the place, and it seemed like hell had taken shape before us. The flames roared like a hungry creature, devouring everything in its path with an intensity I had never seen before. The heat was so suffocating that it seemed to melt the air, and the smoke was so thick that each breath burned the throat. The darkness of the night was interrupted only by the orange and red glow that danced in the shadows, while soot fell like black SN covering everything. We parked the truck near a slope, and the team quickly climbed out, adjusting the equipment. I looked around and felt a knot in my stomach. Something was wrong. The fire advanced in a strangely selective way, ignoring certain areas as if it had a mind of its own. Some of the most luxurious mansions appeared almost untouched, while simpler homes had been reduced to rubble. It was as if the flames had chosen their targets. Our radio was a cacophony of distress calls. We ran towards one of the most critical areas, where the fire was advancing quickly along a narrow street. Charred cars lay abandoned, their frames twisted by the heat. Animals fled in desperation, some falling before they even reached the edge of the fire, intoxicated by the smoke. As we advanced, we saw a group of residents trying to put out the flames with buckets of water. The scene was desperate. Their expressions were pure terror. But there was something else. In their eyes, a kind of resignation, as if they knew there was no escape. "Jack, West Sector, we need backup now," Ramirez shouted, pulling me back to reality. We ran towards the next mission, but something made me stop. A truck was parked near an abandoned warehouse. It had no markings from the fire department or other authority, and that immediately caught my attention. "Ramirez, did you see that?" I pointed to the vehicle. He glanced over and grumbled, "Leave it alone, Jack. We have work to do." But something about that truck felt out of place, like it didn't belong there. The radio chirped again, this time with more urgency. "South Sector. The fire is spreading too fast. It's like I'm being fed by something." The words made my heart race. Mike, the youngest on the team, looked at me with wide eyes. "Jack, what's going on? This is not normal. It feels like the sky itself is on fire." As we fought to contain the flames, the world around us seemed to fall apart. Ramirez's voice and radio instructions jumbled together in my head, but all I could think was, why is the fire advancing like this? Something was out of place, and I knew deep down that that night was just beginning. Have you ever had the feeling that something doesn't fit? That night, in the midst of the flames, I realized that the fire was not just fire. There was something bigger going on, something most people don't see until it's too late. What if disasters like this aren't just accidents? The connections are disturbing. A silent collapse is unfolding all around us, and few are prepared to understand or react. But there is a way to see beyond what we are shown and prepare for what may come. In the pinned comments, I left you a gift, an exclusive ebook about the global collapse. It reveals what many choose to ignore and shows how you can protect yourself while there's still time. Understand before it's too late. Check it out in the comments. The chaos around us seemed to give no respite. Flames, consumed houses, trees, and any hope of control. Even so, my focus shifted to something that didn't seem to belong there. The same strange truck that I had noticed before was now closer, parked in an area almost engulfed in fire. It was as if he had been strategically positioned there. I looked at Ramirez, pointing discreetly. Do you see that? It's been bothering me since the beginning. He narrowed his eyes, clearly suspicious. That's not our equipment, he replied. I'll check. As he approached, I continued to monitor the flames, but my mind was focused on the truck. A few minutes later, Ramirez returned, holding his helmet in one hand and his face paler than ever. They said they are from the city hall, he began, but hesitated. Jack, why on earth would a city truck be carrying barrels of fuel in the middle of a fire? My stomach sank. Before he could respond, the radio exploded into static and screams. Alpha T, we need reinforcement in the central sector. We are losing control. Ramirez shook his head, visibly frustrated. We don't have time for this right now. Jack, let's go. We went back to work, but that revelation wouldn't leave my head. Fuel in the middle of a fire. That didn't make sense. Later, as we helped evacuate the last residents, I heard voices in the distance. They seemed muffled by the smoke, but the words were clear enough to make me freeze in place. Two men dressed in neutral clothes were talking near a partially destroyed fence. Are you sure this is where it started? We can't leave a trace. Shut up and do what you're told. We're almost done. My heart raced. Were they talking about the fire? Before I could approach, quick footsteps and the sound of a vehicle door closing indicated that the men were gone. The silence that followed was as disturbing as the words I had just heard. I started connecting the dots. The truck with the barrels, the suspicious conversation, the fire that seemed to advance strategically. None of this was a coincidence. This fire was not like the others I had faced in all these years. As I processed all of this, another urgent transmission cut through my thoughts. Has anyone seen unusual activity near the abandoned warehouse? Warehouse, I need to confirm. The message was interrupted abruptly. My priority was saving lives. But what I was seeing and hearing told me that we were dealing with something much bigger and much darker than a natural disaster. The heat was almost unbearable, but we continued on, guided by the urgency of the radio calls. Soon we came across a group of residents trapped on a road that was supposed to be an evacuation route. Huge logs blocked the path, arranged so precisely that it seemed impossible that they were there by chance. The flames advanced dangerously, and their faces reflected pure despair. A woman held a child in her lap, her face covered in soot and tears. Please don't leave us here. We have nowhere to go. His voice shook, mixing fear and exhaustion. Ramirez and I acted quickly, trying to clear a path for them as the fire roared closer and closer. We managed to get them out of there, but that scene made me uncomfortable. Why was that route so deliberately blocked? After evacuating the survivors, we headed to a partially destroyed house. The place was in ruins, but something told us there might be people there. What we found was much worse than we expected. Bodies scattered across the floor, victims who were unable to escape. But something was wrong. The burns covering the bodies were not typical of a forest fire. They were irregular, deep, and with marks that looked like chemicals. Jack, look at this. Ramirez pointed to a burned bottle, partially hidden under the rubble. The smell emanating from it was strong, metallic, and completely different from what we are used to smelling in fires. I picked it up carefully and noticed that there were remnants of a viscous liquid at the bottom. Everything indicated that it was linked to the burns. Before we could process what that meant, the radio crackled again with a message that froze me. We are surrounded. They don't want us to leave. I need help now. The broadcast was cut off abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. Ramirez looked at me, and I knew he was thinking the same thing as me. They, who were they? We ran towards the source of the call, but when we arrived, the scene was bleak. A fire truck was on its side, completely blocking the path. Tire tracks indicated he had skidded, but there was no sign of the team. It was as if they had been taken by surprise. With no time to react, I looked around, trying to find some explanation. The evidence was starting to pile up. The blocked routes, the strange burns, the suspicious bottles, and this disturbing call. None of this made sense if it was just a natural fire. As I looked at the wreckage, a mix of anger and helplessness consumed me. What was happening? There was no ordinary disaster. It was something planned, carefully orchestrated, and increasingly, the truth seemed to be buried beneath the flames. When we returned to the barracks, the air was thick with tension. It wasn't just the usual tiredness after hours of fighting the flames. There was something else, an oppressive silence that made even the lightest footsteps echo like thunder. Ramirez was fidgeting next to me, but it was the behavior of our manager, Tom Hargrove, that really caught my attention. Tom was a methodical man, always calm, even in crisis situations, but that night he was different. He avoided eye contact and spoke in whispers to another officer. As soon as he saw us, he ended the conversation abruptly and disappeared into his room, slamming the door. Ramirez gave me a look that said it all. He knew. "Jack," he murmured. "I bet my life I knew this was going to happen." Ramirez had always been the team's skeptic, but now there was a conviction in his voice that bothered me. Without thinking much, I went to Tom's room and knocked on the door loudly. He opened it, visibly uncomfortable. "Jack, you need to rest." "It was a rough night," he said, but his tone was more of an order than a suggestion. "Hard doesn't begin to describe it," I replied, crossing my arms. "What's going on, Tom? Why aren't we hearing the truth?" Tom looked away, fidgeting nervously with his wristwatch. "You're tired, Jack. Don't start with theories. Our priority is to control the fire." I could feel my blood boil. Control. This was no ordinary fire, and you know it. I want to know why there were barrels of fuel at the site, why the routes were blocked, and most importantly, why some areas were left untouched while others were destroyed. For a moment he hesitated. His face was a mix of frustration and barely concealed guilt. "You're seeing things where there aren't, Jack. Go home and rest," he said, ending the conversation abruptly. But before leaving, something caught my eye. On his desk, a large envelope with the seal of a famous real estate developer, the same name I had heard repeatedly during the land disputes in the fire region. My heart accelerated. I left the room, and Ramirez was waiting for me. "And there?" he asked, his voice full of expectation. "He's hiding something," I replied. "And let's find out what it is." That night, as I drove home, my mind was at war. Why would an experienced manager like Tom avoid answering direct questions? What did the developer have to do with the fire? And the most disturbing thing, how many more people were involved? The pieces were starting to come together, but I knew the deeper I dug, the greater the risk. After that conversation with Tom, sleep seemed impossible. Every detail of the fire rotated in my mind like a piece of a macabre puzzle. The bodies found, the logs blocking the routes, the fuel barrels, and most importantly, the suspicious behavior of the manager. There was something wrong, something that didn't make sense. The next morning, with a forgotten cup of coffee beside me, I began to investigate. The first thing I looked up was the developer, whose stamp was on the envelope on Tom's desk. Within minutes, the answers started pouring in, and they weren't good. I discovered that the area where the fire started had been the subject of legal disputes. For years, local groups resisted the demolition of old houses to make way for luxury developments. But now, with the fire, all those houses were destroyed. It was as if the fire had done the work that no one could resolve in the courts. The pieces began to fall into place, and the connection with the developer seemed too obvious to be a coincidence. I kept digging, scouring social media and local forums. It was then that I found reports of evacuated residents. Some mentioned hearing explosions before the fire started, as if something had been detonated. An elderly man who lived near the starting point said he saw men with flashlights moving metal boxes the night before. That made me freeze. Were they preparing something? The accumulated evidence was already disturbing, but I needed something more concrete. I picked up the phone and called Ramirez. "I have to tell you something." The fire area was being contested by the developer, whose seal was on Tom's desk. Now that the houses have been destroyed, they have a clear path to build. "Do you think it was intentional?" Ramirez asked, hesitation in his voice. "I don't think so, Ramirez. I know, but I need more proof. I decided I needed to return to the fire site alone. The fire was already under control, but the devastation was like a battlefield. I walked through the rubble carefully, looking for any clue that might confirm my suspicions. It was then that I saw something shining among the ashes. I crouched down and pulled out what looked like a fragment of burnt metal. I looked closely and realized it was part of a device, something that looked designed to start a fire remotely. The knot in my stomach tightened. I knew I was dealing with something bigger than I could have imagined. Every piece of evidence pushed me to the same conclusion. That fire was not an accident. It was calculated, planned, and executed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Now, with the fragment in hand, I knew I was getting myself into something dangerous. But there was no going back, not after everything I had seen. Returning to the scene of the fire was like revisiting a nightmare. Heat still emanated from the ground, and the air was filled with a metallic smell mixed with smoke that never seemed to go away. The ruins of the houses lay motionless, like ghosts of a life that had been violently cut short. Every step I took over the wreckage echoed in my mind as a reminder of what was at stake. I wasn't there to dwell on the tragedy. I was there to find answers. As I walked through the rubble, my eyes caught something familiar. More metallic fragments, similar to what I had found before. I collected them carefully, feeling that they might hold the key to unlocking what was happening. But the same question haunted me. What were these devices? And who put them here? Suddenly, I heard voices. Frozen, I looked for a place to hide and ducked behind a pile of rubble. Two silhouettes appeared on the horizon, walking towards me. Men in suits with confident steps and low tones. It's done. The area is clean. No one will find out, said the first, with disturbing tranquility. Don't underestimate people, replied the second, with a warning tone. Someone could be putting the pieces together. We need to stay alert. My muscles tensed as I watched. One of them carried something that made me gasp softly. A radio identical to the one we use in the fire department. My brain struggled to process it. Why would they be using our frequencies? When they started to walk away, I followed them carefully. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I knew I couldn't let that clue slip away. It was then that I heard something that confirmed my suspicions. With the free land, investors will profit a lot, said one of them as they stopped to look at a plan on a tablet. This area is going to transform. My heart raced. That was it. The fire was not a natural disaster or a coincidence. It was deliberately planned. A sacrifice of human lives in the name of money and greed. It all made sense. The blocked routes, the fuel barrels, the chemical burns. I had all the pieces. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to control my breathing. My hands were shaking. I knew I had enough to lay it all out, but I also knew what it meant. Putting my life at risk was already a reality, but the possibility of involving my family was unbearable. As I walked back to the car, the last sentence I heard from those men echoed in my mind. No one will find out they were wrong. I knew too much. But how long did I have before they discovered I was putting the pieces together? Driving home that night was like carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. The silence in the car was almost deafening, broken only by the muffled sound of the engine. With every mile, my mind relived the grimmest details of what I had witnessed. The charred bodies, the logs blocking the exits, the men in suits talking about profits as lives were consumed by the flames. When I got home, Emily was in the living room waiting for me, like she always did. But that night, her look was different. There wasn't just concern. There was fear. Without saying anything, she walked over and wrapped me in a hug. What happened out there, Jack? I wanted to tell everything. I wanted to unload the weight that seemed to crush my chest, but he couldn't. Not because of a lack of confidence, but because he knew that the less she knew, the safer she would be. Nothing you want to hear, Emily. Just another rough night. She pulled back a little, studying my face. Whatever it is, Jack, don't let it consume you. I've seen what this job can do to you. His words accompanied me to the bedroom, but sleep didn't come. The next morning, I sat at the table with everything I had managed to gather. The metal fragments, the residents' reports, the connections with the developer, and the conversations I heard the night before. It was enough to expose Cho's everything. But that also meant risking everything. Not just my life, but Emily's as well. The phone rang. Ramirez was on the other end of the line, his voice thick with concern. Jack, you need to let this go. This is bigger than us. I've seen people try to mess with this kind of thing before, and it didn't end well. He was right. This was bigger than both of us. But how could I ignore it? How can I continue my life pretending that none of this happened, knowing that more lives could be sacrificed for greed? I spent the day pondering, but deep down, I already knew what I needed to do. I decided to act, but with caution. I took all the evidence I had, the snippets, the reports, even the notes I took, and sent them anonymously to an investigative journalist I knew I could trust. It was risky, but it was the most I could do without compromising my family. Days passed, and the story began to circulate. But as I feared, the big, influential names remained in the shadows, untouched. The fire was officially declared under control, but I knew it was just the beginning. The truth was still buried, and those responsible were free to continue their dangerous games. Sometimes Emily catches me staring into space. She knows something in me has changed forever. And it changed. There are nights when I ask myself, have I done enough? Was anonymous action enough to prevent this from happening again? This doubt eats at me. It's an invisible scar, but it's as deep as any physical wound. A constant reminder of a night I will never forget. If you've made it this far, you know that the story we just shared isn't just about a fire. It's about something much bigger, something that could be happening around us, without us even realizing it. This type of event makes us wonder, are we really prepared to face the unexpected? And most importantly, how do we protect those we love most when the world seems to be falling apart? Therefore, I want to remind you of something special that I left in the pinned comments. It's unique material that can open your eyes to situations like this. A practical guide that will help you understand what's really going on, and more importantly, how to prepare for difficult times. But be careful. I don't know how long this will still be available, so enjoy it while you can. Oh, and don't forget, like this video, subscribe to the channel to follow more stories, and share with whoever you think needs to hear this. The more people know what could be behind events like this, the more prepared we will be to face whatever comes. Check out the gift in the comments and let me know what you think. I really want to know what you think.